After decades of not knowing how he looks, we finally get to see how the real Vegapunk looks. And let me tell you, I was not expecting that design. The design is ugly. And well, it's nothing new. I mean, Uda likes to make these ugly designs of well-known characters for a while. And in a way, the design he makes actually makes sense on how Vegapunk technically should look. The best way to describe him is a giant head, a bloated belly, small stature but a giant head, and most pronouncedly a tongue that always sticks out, aka a slight resemblance to Albert Einstein, who many in myths call the smartest man in the world. Or maybe they didn't call him the smartest man in the world, but many did say that Einstein was one of the best. So it makes sense for the real Vegapunk to have a design that very well captures Einstein. But that giant head, it's inhumanly large, at least in the past. In the future, his head is a bit smaller, but then again, he has a large metal cap there, which suggests again that all the six satellites has each a part of his brain, and that's why it is smaller. But again, that is a theory. Speaking of theories, this chapter really brought along a lot of theories that confirmed a lot of things. From me, the Angry Myth and the Despair Reviewer, One Piece chapter 1066. First of all, the cover page is the other ones, and Caesar returning to German Kingdom. Ugh. I just hope they can destroy that kingdom one day. I mean, the Straw Hats or someone. As for the rest of the chapter, Shaka keeps talking to the crew about the Void Century. Now, even beginning to say many different things that is a theory. Which of course Usopp and Nami don't like to hear, because hearing this would mean death. And I'm just closing my ears and just saying, oh, come on. You are traveling and befriending, and one of the best friends is Nico Robin, one of the most wanted people in the world. Or at least the most requested people in the world. And now you are closing your ears saying, I don't want to hear about all this. It was obvious you were going to hear about this. In fact, a lot of reviewers seems to actually react very surprised when Robin begins to talk about the Void Century, apparently implying that they didn't even pry any further in her knowledge into it. In fact, when they even talk about the Ohara incident, they seem to be even more surprised about that. I mean, they learned everything in the flashback, sort of. But I have to say, yeah, it makes sense for the Straw Hats to react this way. Because, yes, they are a tight grip family, but you have to realize they don't dwell in the past of their members. Unless someone talks about their past, that is the one past they will hear about. They are focusing on the future, not the past. They learn from the past, and if someone has a struggle, which makes them empathize with each other. But they don't pry any further, because that's what they aren't. They are not priors. They are simply guys who moves forward. So Shaka begins to talk about the ancient kingdom having been scientifically advanced and then being destroyed by the 20 kings that will later become the world government. We still don't know the name of the rest of the 18 though, but given the fact that we're now getting close to the Void Century and the ancient kingdom being a futuristic tech, then things are really getting juicy. So, and then Robin herself questions why is Shaka, or as they call him, Vegapunk here, talking about all this, because surely he is not immune to all this. And Shaka does confirm everything that he is talking about will very likely make him eliminated too. But Shaka, or Vegapunk, is an ally of scholars. So he then begins to talk about the Ohara, actually revealing a surprising fact that a lot of us have neglected to mention, about the fact that the will of Ohara lives. And the Ohara lives is not because Nico Robin lives. No, it is because of something else. He even begins to talk about Professor Clover, as we all know him, the man that Robin looked up to, the best scholar in the world. Apparently in his youth, he liked to travel on the ships, even wore a sword, and even back then had a clover-like hairstyle. And just like Kaido has been imprisoned by the Marines many times, but each time he escaped. I'm kind of surprised he actually managed to be off the radar after that. Granted, maybe he wasn't. He did study the Void Century. But I am surprised that even though for all of his famous exploring and always being hunted by the Marines, hell, even in the past he almost looks like a pirate, mind you. I'm actually a bit surprised that for all of that he's managed to stay alive until the O'Hara incident. I am kind of surprised by that. That either means that Clover had very crazy good survival skills, or the government just decided that it was very difficult to eliminate this one man when he gathered so much support, and in the end decided that when the support was all in one place, it was better to erase everything right there and there. It's not exactly known. But Vegapunk Shaka begins to talk about when Vegapunk, the real Vegapunk, or as he calls himself by the way, this also begs a little bit different things. As we said before, we still don't exactly know what these satellites work like. Are they all robots with Vegapunk's brains, or are they clones? I mean, granted, Edison and Pythagoras, they look like robots. The rest do not really look that much like robots. But it still is not exactly known if they are all robots sharing Vegapunk's brain, which actually should make them half robots. I mean, maybe they have robot bodies but organic brains. Then that should mean that they all have Vegapunk's memories. But they still, again, seem to have their most basic different urges. But Shaka, on the other hand, Shaka seems to be the closest to having the personality or even the mind of the real Vegapunk. Granted that since Shaka is number one and the good, I think that would actually make sense. So Shaka Vegapunk begins to talk about the victory of O'Hara. Well, not exactly victory, but he managed to get to that island some months ago after it was destroyed, and he was so saddened by the fact that it was burned to the ground and even the Tree of Knowledge was gone. But there was one thing that moved his tears, and that was the one victory that the O'Harian had over the government. And if you recall, they threw all the books into a lake. I didn't actually pay any attention to that, because when the Marines saw them, they just ignored them. And I thought, well, okay, the books didn't burn, but they still ended up in the water. The text would have been wiped out. It would have been useless to use these books again. But apparently, according to Vegapunk, that was not the case. The books ended up there, and thus all the knowledge they have gathered over the centuries survived. Hearing this, Robin once again remembers the tragic incident about the world, and as well as Saul's last words to her about, well, not, or granted those were not the last words, but your mother is noble and O'Hara fought against the world. It causes her to be moved to tears, and confirms the theory that Vegapunk has, showing that the theory is indeed the truth. And how did he know all this? Well, he actually met another person on O'Hara. Because as we know, or learn in the chapter, Vegapunk actually was an old acquaintance to Clover, but he was not the only one. There was another one who was an acquaintance of Vegapunk, and I tell you, this is the greatest part of the chapter, and that is, it was Dragon. Yes, finally Dragon gets a little bit more involved in here, and it turns out that the books were saved by none other than Elbath Giants, which also is good, because that means the Elbath finally gets brought back into the story. I don't exactly know how they managed to hide it, but it also makes sense when you think about it. Because Elbath is called the strongest kingdom in the world. Granted, a lot of people have managed to defeat giants pretty easily. But it also makes sense because seeing that the government are not willing to risk fighting against the giants that much, it would actually make perfect sense for the surviving books of O'Hara to be hidden right over there. Because the Marines, even though with all their devil fruits and haki and all that stuff, would not dare setting their foot on giants. Granted, we still haven't really exactly seen a giant army that can push back a Marine, even with a devil fruit. Which made, I guess in the end only the strongest can do that, and grunts and all those other people are not exactly the strongest. So it makes sense for the Elbath Giants to be the ones to carry these books and hid them. And they were led by a big giant with many scars. So 22 years ago, as you all know, when Robin was young, Dragon met Vegapunk there. They were already well acquainted, and And back then, Vegapunk was the director of Punkasar Lab. He was age 43, which probably means that Vegapunk is only 65 years old. I thought he was older. And Dragon, this one, was captain of a freedom fighters, which was the first name of his revolutionary group. He was 33. It is worth noting that he did not have the tattoos on his face, but he did have something markers on his jeans. Once again bringing the question of a dragon's origin. Who is Dragon really? Or more likely, who was he part of? The fact that he was all there and knew all about this, it must mean he is connected to the Marines somehow. Either way, he met Vegapunk, told he was an acquaintance of Clover, and also grilled Vegapunk for becoming a lapdog when apparently he once asked him to join the Freedom Fighters. But as it turns out, although we still don't exactly know how Vegapunk joined the government, especially since he was a part of the MADS, we do know for a fact that, as Atlas and Lilith have all talked about, money is needed to further his research. And the government had the money, so of course he would join. These poor freedom fighters would not have done that, which Dragons does understand. Also, Vegapunk makes a pretty, I would say, not strange word, but at the same time good knowledge, and that is the organization of the world government is massive, and there are reasonable people to be found, apparently implying that Vegapunk did not only join the government because they had the money, but also because he hoped to find those people that could be reasoned with, therefore showing that the government couldn't completely be immoral. But of course, while Dragon did admit that, he also didn't like the fact that what the government did, because attacking all these innocent people. I really like Dragon in this one. He really shows that he is a man that despises true cruelty. And even though the Oharian may have researched the Void Century and all that stuff, what the government did in this scenario is one of the biggest unforgivable acts they have ever done. Because everything Dragon says here is true. The Oharians were merely speaking their minds, and in the end they ended up in a cruel, unfair force of the law. A powerless academics was wiped out by a military ambush. That is not justice. And so it was actually during this one moment where Dragon changed. As Vegapunk says, you despite your hatred of war. This implies again that Dragon actually do not like war. It doesn't imply that he was a pacifist, and unfortunately it once again doesn't show if he is strong. But it does show that after the Oharians were wiped out, Dragon's heart was hardened. He was already a captain of a freedom fighter, which apparently was a very poor but still small group of people that were willing to fight for some kind of freedom. Again, going with his moniker of DD. But after the Oharians were wiped out, he vowed to form a military force this time to fight back. Apparently implying that as much as Dragon despised war, he also knew that people of cruelty can only be wiped out if you are cruel yourself. Or more likely, if you don't fight back fire with fire, you can't defeat it. Or perhaps he just thought that this is you need to show force in this scenario. And he was gonna change the world and make sure to do it. And so it is revealed that the founders of the Revolutionary Army are Dragon and Ivankov and Bartolomeo. It makes sense for Ivankov to be a founder because he was already close to Dragon and only called him Dragon and not Dragon's son. It also makes sense because Ivankov is the queen of Kawabaka Kingdom, the city of Okamas, and has the Horo Horo no Mi, which allows him to change everything on a person. So it makes sense for Ivankov to be with freedom, because for Ivankov you have the freedom in everything, even the choices of your sex. So that makes sense. And Bartolomeo being a founder is also a very juicy detail, because it again forms a very mysterious mystery on his origin, because it again implies that Kuma was overthrown by the government in an unjustified action, and he really showed force in order to change that. So that was it all. And eventually Punk Hazard, we still don't exactly know though if Vegapunk turned into Cyborg or anything, as Frankie asks, but I still think though that this does imply This does imply that, again, Kuma becoming a pacifista, that was actually a plan. And I think a plan he actually followed through for a greater good. Um, uh, uh, so the books, surviving books, Oharians ended up in Elbaf, which Vegapunk eventually took a trip to and read the codes and memorized all of the research into his brain. And who was this captain uh, who put him back? Well, we see a silhouette of him, a man carrying a thick bandages, and that implies that it was none other than Jaguar the Saul, who were supposed to be dead in Oharian. And this is one of the few moments that I'm actually not mad of Oda to apparently implying that he is alive. Or implying, it's actually practically confirmed he is alive. Because, yes, Jaguar D. Saul's supposed death, that was one of the most heartbreaking and emotional moments Odanon's ever created. And his last words to Robin, that just touches the heart. It was pure heartwarming. So even if Jaguar Saul would be alive, that would actually not diminish it. But it also begs the question, how did he survive? He was frozen solid by Kusan, but you have to realize that, yes, this is a One Piece world. A lot of people can survive a lot of things. But just because he was frozen, that didn't mean he would die, actually. We thought he would die, but apparently he didn't. But it also implied that he didn't leave that island unscathed. He has severe frostbite, which is scars. Also implying that the man with the burn marks may very well be Saul. But again, that's a theory. The bigger question now is, how did he thaw? Did Kusan freeze him knowing he would survive? He did say that Saul was an old friend of him. Or did the fires over Ohara actually melt the ice? Well, I wouldn't put it past it, but I thought for sure that the cannon fire that they did would have actually shattered his core, shattered his frozen body, but apparently it didn't. So Robin can only shed tears of happiness knowing that Saul is alive, as Vegapunk confirms, but he cannot say where he is. And Vegapunk Shaka says he is a follower of all skeletons, then pulls them away to show them something else. So Luffy's group farm their robots and tries to make it move, but suddenly something ends up in the middle of the robot, and that is the real Vegapunk, the current Vegapunk of many years ago. Apparently did an experiment of time-space get twisted. So Luffy pulls him out, and Vegapunk immediately recognizes him as Dragon's son, and also greets Bonnie as much as a groan. Very casual, the fact that he turned his friend Kuma into a pacifista, and since Kuma is also Bonnie's father, again implying that there is a greater reason why Kuma became a pacifista, and also revealed, and so the final pings of the chapter reveals as Luffy and Chopper experiments on the boosters which allowed them to hover, very similar to the Germa Kingdom's hover boots, implying that they stole those designs from Vegapunk, or Vegapunk just has the different ones. I don't really know, to be honest. Again, Vegapunk and Judge worked on the same group once upon a time, so it's not that far-fetched that they have the same technology. But I'm still living the fact that Vegapunk's technology must be superior to Judge. Either way, they push it down and they far up much, and that and even though Vegapunk just says that's very strange, requests her help. And so we are introduced finally to the real Vegapunk. And again, his current body is very, very strange. While he still has his tongue out, looks a bit older, his head has now shrunken down, it seems to be open, and he seems to have an apple-like structure as a hat or something like that. Almost like his hat had become an apple or something. So that implies his brain has shrunken, and also implies that he somehow did split his brain into the different sex satellites. How he did that, though, is not yet revealed. Was it a devil fruit, or was it just his science? I want to believe it was his science. Either way, after so many decades, we have finally been introduced to Vegapunk. And yeah, the design is ugly, but it's official. The real Vegapunk is a good man. Or at least he's an ally of scholars. But what will happen next, I don't know. We still don't exactly know how this arc will go. But given the fact that Bonnie recognized Vegapunk, yeah, that would make sense. So, for once in a lifetime, I have to say, this was a boomer of a chapter. It was amazing. But you give me your thoughts if you have any.